The legend and mystery of Hairy Bob's cave.
Oh no, here we go again. More bloody researchers. Can't get any peace from here. I'm alright. That's it. I'm off.
This little rock has been the subject of many local folklore tales. The most popular is that the rock was made into a cave by some of the workers who were building the marine drive. It has acquired the name Hairy Bob's Cave as many people believe a local hermit or tramp called Bob lived in the cave. This photo prompted a recent discussion and a BBC video featuring the cave. This is a World War I tank. It was on display on the marine drive, just about in front of where the cave is. That photo is dated 1919. Anthony Springhall, who is one of our group members, spotted the cave, and he has stated that this is the earliest photo of the cave that he has seen. That prompted the short BBC film with Ant narrating it. Well, even before I had seen that BBC film, I had already decided to pay another visit to the cave and update my own research. The last time I went to the cave was 14 years ago. Now all of us in Scarborough have been brought up on tales of the cave, and we have all at some time in our lives had a look at it. Here are a few of those stories. Myth has it a local salesman called Hairy Bob, who by all accounts went door to door selling sandstone soap, a product used to scrub the front steps of houses. Though some suggest he used to hide out in the house when his overbearing wife nagged him too much. The truth is probably more mundane. Liz Austin said, "We called it Harry Bogart's cave when we were a kid in the 60s. And here's a picture from Diane Temple. What does this remind you of? And then there's Freddie Tate, who sent in this little rhyme. Hairy was an old man who never cut his hair. Then one day, while washing it in the sea and having a swim, he got his hair caught in between the rocks. And he couldn't get free as the tide came in. He began to bob up and down between the rocks and taking gulps of air. He eventually got free, but he never washed his hair in the sea again. And people who saw his plight called out, 'There's Hairy Bob!'" Maria Webdale. I was led to believe that Hairy Bob had an affair, possibly with Henry II's wife. So he was beaten and thrown off the keep, but he survived and made a house out of a rock, just out of sight so he could still see his love. They got caught and he was sent to York to be hung, drawn and quartered. I honestly thought that was a true story in my adulthood.
I'm scared of heights. Please, no. That's not nice.
Jane Thompson. I can remember my nan, Madge Crawford, saying to us kids when we were misbehaving, "That's it, if you lot don't stop it, I'm going to live in Hairy Bob's." I also remember my mum saying the kids in the late 20s and 30s playing on the tank. The powers that be took it away during World War II to melt it down. Missy Meeks. I know it as two different names. Me mum and others used to call it both Hairy Bob's and Hairy Baboon's hut. One day in the late 90s I was driving by there with me mum and we saw a Sky BSB squarial had been erected. Luckily we were stuck in traffic, and which gave us a good 10 minutes to laugh like mad at the sight. So there you are, that's just a few of the wonderful tales. Even so, nothing has ever been proved and is unlikely to be. So the general opinion is that the workers chiselled out the cave when they were building the marine drive. Now let's have a look at that option. In 1866 work started on building the North Bay Pier. It was opened 3 years later in 1869. At that time the only way to get to the pier was down Albert Road, what we locals call Chain Hill, or by travelling down the cliff lift. You could also get to the pier from Peasholm Gap, but in those early days you would be walking along the beach rather than a promenade. Later Albert Drive was built and access to the pier was greatly improved. It was decided to build a new road around the base of the castle cliff, the Marine Drive. Work started in May 1897 and the drive was opened to the public in 1908, something like 10 years later. So for 30 years there had been no building work at all on the Marine Drive. This picture taken from the pier shows exactly what it looked like. We will come back to that picture soon. Now let's look at the work that was carried out. The first section went from the pier to the purpose-made tunnel called Lady Dock. Then work continued on the rest of the drive and you can see how all the materials were stored on the site. There's all the huts, the steam cranes and the little railway that was used to get the concrete blocks into their allotted places. The most popular theory claims that the rock was chiselled out so that some of the workers could shelter or take their breaks. It's a bit daft when you think about it because as you can see there are plenty of huts on the site. I really cannot see anyone wanting to sit inside a damp and dirty bit of rock rather than in a hut that will have a stove and, more importantly, a kettle. In this photo you can see the cave behind all the concrete blocks. Okay, so you've seen a lot of photos showing how the drive was built. This drawing shows the pier and no Marine Drive or Albert Drive. All we have is rocks and sand. No construction work at all to the base of the castle foot. Again, this photo shows the same scene. Now back to the photo I showed you earlier. Still no building work and the base of the castle foot is very much in a natural state. Let's take a closer look. And there it is. Okay, so the picture isn't that great, but you can clearly see that this is Hairy Bob's. The picture was taken long before any work on creating the Marine Drive was carried out. In my opinion, this rules out the theory that the workers building the drive chiselled out the rock. And there's another thing on this map. That little object. What is it? Well, at one time the army had a shooting and firing range inside the castle grounds that was later moved to the base of the castle foot. There were 2 targets and associated huts. Here we can see them more clearly. The firing range was in use when the pier was built. They used the pier as a firing platform for the guns. This is clearly shown in this map, 1892. Eventually the firing range was moved to Scarborough Mills. Of course, once the drive was underway, it would not have been possible to have the army shooting with all those construction workers in the way. Now going back to the cave itself. It is pretty obvious that the rock has fallen directly from the cliffs above. Looking around the rock, I couldn't find any chisel marks. I have spent many years working with stone. Although the alterations, for want of a better word, are at least 150 years old. There is a lot of evidence of old fires that have been lit over the years, and of course there is the erosion from the elements. Even so, I would have expected to have seen some sort of evidence of tools being used. Most of the photos show 2 openings, the windows. In fact, there is only one. The right hand side bit is not open and it looks more like a heart shaped. Somebody has obviously tried to chop that out. Perhaps the heart was chiselled out back in the days of Henry II when that chap fell in love with Henry II's wife before he was chopped into bits. You never know. The cave is big enough to sit in and take shelter, as you can see. I am pretty convinced that this cave was around before the workers started the Marine Drive. Perhaps the army lads chopped this out when they had the firing range in the mid to late 1800s. It is also very possible that this has been there for hundreds of years. It may well have been there in Henry II's time, or even when Cromwell was blasting the castle with his cannons. I don't suppose we will ever find out the exact truth. And what about Hairy Bob? Whoops, sorry, that's Ant, not Bob. I found an old court report dated 1895. The first case was on the 13th of November against a local vagrant called Robert Bogg, known locally as Hairy Bob. He was accused of begging and the case was dismissed. So clearly we had a character wandering around town that was known to all as Hairy Bob. Going by that court report, he was homeless and living as a tramp. So it is very feasible that he took shelter at some time in the cave. I think the majority of the holes in the cave were formed naturally when the rock fell from the cliffs above. Over time I reckon various people have chipped away at it, maybe for a bit of fun or maybe to try and provide a bit of shelter when needed. Well, that's my opinion based on what I have shown you. What do you think? Thanks for watching.